Hello and welcome to Mythmakers. Mythmakers is the podcast for fantasy fans and fantasy creatives, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. My name is Julia Golding, and today I am joined by a very special guest who I met in our favourite town of Oxford, and that is Dr. Lorna Robinson. Now, I invited Lorna onto the podcast because she has a number of interesting strings to her bow, not just as a writer herself, but also through her work in education. So Lorna is the founder of the Iris project, which takes information or exposure to the classical world and its myths into state schools in the UK. And she's also the founder director of the Rumble Museum, which is a very unusual project in that it's an accredited museum, but actually in a school in Oxford. And that is the Cheney School. So if you know anything about Oxford, that's up towards where C.S. Lewis lived, on the road up the road to Headington, a large state school. Anyway, so welcome to Lorna.
Thank you. I'm really delighted to be on the podcast today and looking forward to having a chat.
Yeah, so Lorna is actually, if you're looking at this on YouTube, she's actually sitting in her museum in the school. So lots of all sorts of creative things like scissors and interesting artifacts behind her. So a creative space within a school. So Lorna, let me ask you first, what took you in the direction of, I suppose, spreading the good news about classical myths for this generation, and why you think it's important to do so?
So I guess if I want to trace it right back to its inception, it was someone giving me an Usborne book of Greek myths and legends when I was about 7 years old. I think that's where the journey started, because I remember being completely enamored with the stories that I met there. And it has, those of you that know the book might have seen the book, has these amazing illustrations of like Medusa and the Minotaur and things like that. So I think I was gripped from quite an early age. And then I was fortunate enough to study Latin at secondary school. And it was through learning Latin and then later ancient Greek that I found my love of classics deepened. Went on to study it here at Oxford University, did my first degree in classics, and then a doctorate in Ovid's Metamorphoses, this amazing poem that we'll probably talk about a bit later on. And this literary movement, magical realism, which I was really interested in. And it was around that time I was supporting my doctorate, like a lot of people do, with teaching. And I had discovered, therefore, that I really loved teaching. I really loved talking about classics and telling young people about classics. But I was aware that the jobs that I could get were all in private schools at the time. And that was something that I suppose was kind of quite deeply on my mind, that I was aware of the limitations of access to classics and this subject that I loved so much. I guess I knew I wanted to be involved in broadening it. I didn't just want to kind of stay teaching in private schools. I wanted to sort of do something that was a bit wider. And so I came up with this idea of setting up a charity that I called the Iris Project, after Iris, the messenger goddess that travels on a rainbow. It started off with a magazine that was designed, called Iris Magazine, and it was designed to present classics in imaginative and creative ways. And we sent free copies to state schools and we sold it to private schools. So that was the model of it. And then gradually we started running projects in state primary and secondary schools, looking at storytelling of myths to teach Latin. And then many years later, I set up a community classics centre at Cheney School, a big comprehensive school, as you mentioned, in Headington and East Oxford. And since then, for about 20 years, really, it's been the base for a lot of the activities and teaching that I do. So a bit of a potted history there.
Yeah, so quite a lot of our listeners are over in the US. So just to explain the sort of state-private thing here, the state education sector is where the vast majority of people go. And the private system, you'll have heard of schools like Eton and those kind of places, better resourced, and that's where classics and classical languages tend to still get taught. So it is regarded as a bit of an elite subject, which is odd, really, because I was about to say that I think this current generation, if my own children, I think to go by, actually know a huge amount about classical stories through very new routes. So they know about it from playing various video games. And in the world of reading, they know about it from the Rick Riordan, Percy Jackson series, but also they read Atticus the Storyteller, another of these collections of books, of stories. And I think that they probably don't need an awful lot of persuading about how relevant it is, because you can point to programs on TV. I mean, there was a recent series called Chaos, wasn't there, which was
There was.
another
Yeah.
version of this. So when you're talking to young people, what's the starting point of their knowledge, do you find? Do you get some kids who know absolutely more than you?
Mhm.
I find that sometimes going around schools. Or
Yeah.
are you often starting from zero with people, trying to actually explain the classical world?
Yeah, so it's a big mix. Definitely, I will occasionally come across students that have like obsessively read every variation of Greek myths, and they'll be like, "Oh, but myths, what about this?" And so
Mm.
they've got kind of an intimate knowledge. But equally, I will meet students that have arrived at Cheney that won't have heard of the Minotaur, or kind of stories that I always sort of associate with lots of children knowing, and that's partly we Cheney is a very diverse catchment, and you get children from lots of different backgrounds. So there's sort of quite a mix of knowledge of classics that comes from different backgrounds. But you're absolutely right. I think that there are things like the Percy Jackson novels, things like Harry Potter.
Oh, yeah.
Those have got young children really kind of interested in stories and myths that are connected to classics. They might not necessarily realize, in the case of Harry Potter, for example, which ones, which things are connected to myth and which aren't. But they're aware of classical stories, and of Latin, and they're interested in it. So I would say that I never experience any kind of negativity about classics from children, whereas very occasionally from parents who have had negative experiences at school, because Latin, I think, for a while it was compulsory for everyone before the school system changed, and it was probably taught in quite an old-fashioned way and put some people off. So I do occasionally get those sort of negative reactions from people who are older, but from children, it's just like, wow, this is really cool stuff. We love these stories. We've read these books. Or they might know nothing, but as soon as they hear the stories, they're really interested, because who wouldn't be? They're really great stories.
And I suppose it's also a bit like being aware of, let me guess, King James Bible underlying so much of literature and poetry, that if you want to understand the history of culture, you need to understand what a reference to Cerberus might mean, or a reference to Eumenides, or I mean, you can go through, pick your pick your poison in the sort of mythical world, because it's given rise to so many retellings or metaphors or images in poetry or references in Shakespeare, that if you don't have some of the big hitters under your belt, like Icarus or something like that, then you will be missing out on a huge range of enriching cultural references.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's definitely true. I think it's sort of, I mean, I definitely think the stories in their own right, even without that knowledge, are really interesting. But knowing the layers of storytelling
Mm.
that lie beyond, adds this enriching aspect to it. And I love the children's faces when they realize some of the kind of backstories, things that they're aware of as well. So it's like this moment of enlightenment. And and one of the reasons I was really drawn, I think, within classics, even before the classical reception of today, where there's lots of retellings, even in the period itself, the Roman authors, for example, they were always trying to retell older Roman and Greek stories. So that spirit of what you might even call like fan fiction was already there. in Greek and Roman times. I feel like Ovid's Metamorphoses in many ways was a little bit like a kind of fan fiction of all the myths that came before him. So I think that spirit is there, and it kind of continues today.
So, speaking about the Ovid Metamorphoses, it links very well to your own book. You've written and published independently The Birder, which you have done in conjunction with the illustrator Lydia Hall, who you've worked with on previous projects retelling. So in a way, it's your own fan fiction about this. Can you say what drew you to write this book? It's not actually aimed at very young children at all. It's very much an adult or YA book title because of the nature of what it's dealing with. Do you want to tell us a bit about that? Because it's got an really fascinating, interesting central conceit, which I guess is your starting point.
Yeah. So it started life back when I was doing my doctorate. So, this is like 25 years ago. And I was reading because my doctorate, as I mentioned, was looking at magical realism, this literary mode associated with Latin America, primarily, and this Roman poem of its Metamorphoses. And I've always loved writing, and I always just wrote lots of random stuff. And I just one day decided, imagine a universe where people metamorphose instead of dying. So I wrote a short story at the time that I just shoved in a drawer and didn't do anything else with for many, many years, because I just wanted to explore what might a world look like where this was what happened to people.
Can you explain that term so people know what you're talking about?
The term metamorphoses.
Yeah. What happens if you don't die but you metamorphose? What happens?
Yes. So in Ovid's poem, the poem is strung together like interconnected stories where people change into other things, or usually things like trees, but sometimes people change into rocks or insects or things like that. So there is, in the world of Ovid's poem, people die as well, but they transform usually at a point of heightened emotion or drama. So, for example, Daphne, when she's running away from the god Apollo, she prays to her father for help, and then she starts to transform into a laurel tree. So you get these kind of intense moments where people transform. In The Birder, it's different in the sense that there is no death in this universe. People don't die. Everyone transforms into an animal of some sort. But this usually happens just like death in our universe as people, become old. But sometimes, again, like death in our universe, people might suddenly metamorphose as young people. And that's something that always is a great tragedy, and scientists and medical professionals are trying to work out why that happens. So we see that in the book, that they are aware that with brain scans, they can see if someone is going to metamorphose sort of before their time, and they're trying to understand the processes as to why. So I really, in the book, I suppose I wanted to use metamorphoses as a way of, I suppose, a bit of a mirror of how we think about death, but because we're looking at it differently through this different concept, it changes, it defamiliarizes death, I suppose, and that shifts how we think about lots of different things. So it was very much inspired by Ovid's Metamorphoses and trying to kind of put into action the central concepts of his poem. But also I wanted, and this is where the magical realism comes in, I wanted to make it feel real, feel like a kind of normal universe, but with this one key change. And I suppose, as well as classics, a big inspiration for the book is a book that maybe many of your listeners might have heard of, called Never Let Me Go, by Kazuo Ishiguro. And I must have read that about 15, well, maybe 10 years ago. And I was very struck by the way that he presented quite a big change in his universe, a scientific change as it was, but in a way that made it feel very normal. So Ovid's poem and that book, in many ways, were the two things that intersected to create the style of The Birder.
So your your main character, Meryl, you start with her brother suddenly, when they're young people together, children, he suddenly turns into a blackbird. It's quite disorientating, that first chapter, when you first read it and you think, what's going on,
Yes. Yeah.
And then as the book unfolds, she's traumatized by that event, but also intrigued by it. So she's trying to, in a very scholarly way, which perhaps reflects the writer, I don't know, but she's
Yeah.
looking into if there's any difference between the bird's song of of birds who have been people and
Yeah.
changed into birds, and your common and garden, uh, bird. And so she's on that quest. And she
Yeah.
has a very good friend, Daniel, whose secret is that he knows when he's going to, um, die, metamorphose. And
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
John, who's the priestly character in it, who's in a way trying to defeat the death in this world by persuading
Yeah.
people they don't have to change.
Yeah.
So I would say it's a story of those three, but you've divided it
Mm.
into chapters named after different birds, and each story reflects something connected with that bird, different ways of metamorphizing.
Yes.
And this lends to uh, great work by your collaborator Lydia Hall, because she does these wonderful, are they woodcuts or lino cuts?
Lido cuts. Yes.
Lino cuts of the various birds. So it's a beautiful volume to actually look into. So it's a case where I would definitely suggest people get the physical copy. It's great fun to actually read and find these very careful illustrations. So when you were writing this, and you were saying you're in this magical realism strain, were you thinking about, it makes me wonder what the Greek writers, as far as we can imagine, what they thought they were doing when they were
Yeah.
coming up with these stories, because they treat these stories as serious, real stories, don't they?
Yeah. Well, it's very difficult. This is one of the big questions about the ancient world, actually, is what did people really believe? And of course, it's to a great extent unknown.
Yeah.
But uh, I mean, I would suggest that a poet like Ovid, who comes quite later in the tradition, and he's sort of a bit of a man about the city of Rome, and he quite likes being clever and witty. And you rather get the sense that he doesn't take any of it too seriously. Whereas if you look at, say, like a poet like Virgil, who Ovid is borrowing heavily from. Virgil is a very serious and intense poet, and it feels like there's more of a deep belief in the gods and everything that's going on. Um, so yes, it's very difficult to tell. One of the things I loved about the Metamorphoses is the way in which, if you look at how Metamorphosis stories are told by the Greek writers and by some of the Roman ones, the actual moment of change is passed over. So Daphne turns into a tree, but it's not really described. It's just presented as something that happens. And what Ovid does is he almost behaves like a scientist. He like wants to get inside. Well, how did that happen? So he imagines, first of all, her hair turns to leaves, and then her feet feel a bit heavy, like they're turning into bark. And so he's definitely very interested in the moment of change, the moment of transformation. Um, I it's it feels to me that he is someone that's enjoying the stories, but doesn't really believe that they happened. Certainly, if we go back to very much more ancient writers like Homer, then it's much more up for grabs. What they believe, and obviously the gods are a key mechanism behind a lot of the magic in their universe, or a lot of the supernatural in their universe, and um, we the bird are very specifically. Obviously, there's a vicar character in it, but it's not the metamorphosis part is not explained by any religious view.
No, but
Yeah,
his role in society is to be at the ceremonies, and so it's,
yeah,
he's conflicted, because they're both, he and Meryl both feel they're in the wrong universe,
yes,
and they
yes,
often say that.
they do. And I mean, in many ways, I suppose the deepest inspiration for the book is, I suppose, my own. I'm I'm not a sort of person of of sort of faith as such. I don't sort of have a certainty about anything. I'm very uncertain about why the universe is the way it is. But I've always had this feeling that we live our lives as mortal creatures, and we know we're going to die. And this feels like a very traumatic thing, but it's just embedded in our universe, and we accept. And part of writing The Birder, I suppose, was to imagine a universe where there wasn't death, and then use Metamorphoses as a way of, I suppose, exploring this. So you mentioned at the beginning, it's not really a book for small children, and you're absolutely right, because it is exploring this big theme of death and how we live with death, and we accept that it's something that's absolutely central to our lives. And yes, it is this very traumatic thing, in many ways, or at least most people feel that it is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why that can't also be what the Greek writers and others were also doing.
Yeah, no,
because
absolutely.
perhaps our categories of did they believe this or not is not the right question so much as to what did they think this said about the nature of being alive. The experience of this strange, if we're lucky, 70 plus years we get, just a blink in the eye of the universe and where that fits. So where are you going next with your exploration of classical myths? There is an environmental theme that you very strongly follow at the Rumble Museum, the connection between these stories and the environment. So where are you going next?
So since The Birder, I've published another book, which was set in Minoan times, but I'm now writing a new book, which I'm hoping to finish in the next few months. And this has a very strong environmental theme, in that it's set in a future universe where the environment has changed, and it weaves in ancient belief, in the sense that there is a political party that is in power that is trying to return some of the Roman ideas about worship of nature into society. So I suppose this book is a blend of exploring Roman religion and myth with environmental change, and therefore also it's sort of straying a little bit into science fiction, because there are some scientific advantages as well. Now, I'm not a scientist, so it's been quite difficult to write those in a way that sounds plausible. Sometimes with the scientific advances, I've sort of left the details a bit opaque, so I don't fall into some kind of error. That's what I'm involved in at the moment, and I'm really enjoying writing about it. And yes, sort of environment is something that, like a lot of people, is sort of a source of deep anxiety and concern for me personally, in terms of thinking about the future of society, and are we all going to manage to make this work, and sort of mitigate some of the effects, and also, as a mother, thinking about what kind of world is it going to be like for my daughter when she's, I don't know, 50 or 60, and things like that.
Yes, indeed. So as your book is very much founded on Ovid's Metamorphoses, do you have a favorite edition of that? I mean, I've most recently read it in the Ted Hughes poetic treatment.
Yes.
Yeah. Where would you direct someone if they wanted to have a go at reading the Ovid version of it?
Gosh. So I do really like the Ted Hughes version. I think it's very loose, in the sense that he's not stuck closely to the Latin, but he's done it in a really interesting way. So I would definitely recommend Ted Hughes, coming from the outside. I think, who isn't a classicist and is not kind of looking at the original Latin, I think Ted Hughes is a great place to start. Other than that, I don't think I have a particular favorite translation. I mean, for example, I quite frequently just used the Penguin translations when I was working with the text. And so there isn't really one to me that stands out it's not like with the Iliad, I have a very strong sense of, I, for example, really enjoy the Lettermore translation. I just think that's the one that I like the best. Although I know there's a newer one by Emily Wilson that I haven't read yet. So I should really get myself reading that. But with Ovid, yes, I think I'll probably say have a look at Ted Hughes, like you suggested, because he has such an interesting take and such a modern take. And I think that's some of the translations might feel a bit clunkier.
Well, he definitely has that kind of blood and sinews sort of.
He does,
because of his poetry and that sort of grittiness. The Yorkshire in him, I think, sort of adds that weight to the physical experience of change. Yeah,
definitely, it's very visceral, and also just the sort of rhythm of his translation. I like it's sort of it works. It's really quite different from Ovid, but I think it's a really good starting place if someone wants to kind of pick it up from fresh, knowing nothing about it.
There does seem to be a bit of a well, it's never really gone away, but just thinking about recent treatments of classical stories, we've had the Ralph Fiennes film, The Return, but also coming up, we've got the Christopher Nolan epic, Odyssey. So I think, we're not, young people are going to be very familiar with many of these stories by the time we finish this year. So are you looking forward to that film, or?
I'm hugely looking forward to it because I'm actually quite a big fan of Christopher Nolan as a director.
Okay.
I think he's very atmospheric and has a really interesting sort of soundscape that he creates and eye for detail. In fact, the other day, YouTube with its clever algorithms worked out to advertise it to me. And so the trailer popped up and I was gripped.
I think that went everywhere because I don't think it's short of a marketing budget.
No, I'm sure that's true. Yes, and so I'm hoping to organise a trip for my sixth form classicists that we'll all go together and watch it because I think that will be really exciting. Perfect. And I love the fact that there's so much retelling of classics going on. It makes it such a fresh and exciting field to be working in and to be teaching in. So,
yes, because each generation finds its own relevance, of course. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us, Lorna. And we look forward to seeing what else you do with classical myths as you go on. So thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Mythmakers podcast, brought to you by the Oxford Centre for Fantasy. Visit oxfordcenterforfantasy.org to join in the fun. Find out about our online courses, in-person stays in Oxford, plus visit our shop for great gifts. Tell a friend and subscribe wherever you find your favourite podcasts worldwide.